Hello, this is Olivia Olson, and you are listening to The Bigger Picture, a podcast where we interview scholars about how their research can make our communities better and more democratic. Today, we're going to look into race, language, unequal justice in the law in Jody Armour's book, N*GGA Theory. Jody, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm honored to discuss your work with you. Would you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure, Olivia. My name is Jody Armour. I'm the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law, University of Southern California Law School. Been here over 20 years. 3 sons, Allende, Nnamdi, Mtume, all proud Trojans in either graduate school or undergrad themselves. And I look forward to us talking about the book and connecting it to current events.
Absolutely. Well, that's a wonderful place for us to start in light of many recent tragedies. And I think that brings me really well to my first question about your process. What inspired your work and what you hope it will achieve, particularly in light of what's been going on in our country?
Yeah, well, I'm really a living legacy of a jailhouse lawyer, I like to say. My dad was incarcerated when I was 8 years of age. Our family was on the receiving end of a Breonna Taylor style no-knock raid. And my 7 brothers and sisters and I were lined up in the wee hours of the morning as a phalanx of cops rifled through our home and allegedly found a bag of marijuana that even as an 8-year-old, I knew didn't materialize out of thin air. And so it had been planted, but be that as it may, my dad was sentenced to 22 to 55 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary for possession and sale of marijuana. And my 7 brothers and sisters and I went from a middle-class existence to crumbs and roaches and rats overnight.
Wow.
And that is where I first saw the power of word work and language, because my dad was in an impossible predicament. His only way out was to teach himself the law, which he did from the warden's own law books, write his own writs of habeas corpus on a manual royal typewriter on his cell floor, represent himself pro se through the state and federal system until he was able to triumph in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in a case I teach in my criminal law class now called Armour versus Salisbury, which stands for the proposition that it's a denial of due process for the state through its prosecutor to deliberately lie to the jury to get a conviction. And so I saw early on from his experience the power of language, of word work, to really make the frozen circumstances that somebody is stuck in dance by playing to them their own melody. He learned the legal lexicon and built it into a tool of liberation, from an instrument of oppression into a tool of liberation.
Wow. That's incredible. And do you think that that experience is perhaps what introduced you to the law?
Oh yeah, that's it. I was introduced to the wonders of the law from that, door being kicked in the no-knock raid, to the ability of the law to try to reduce an uppity Negro to his station that they thought he should stay in, to put him in his place. And yet he was also able to use that same law that was used as a corrupt, force of oppression as a force of liberation. He was able to find new possibilities in the legal lexicon that weren't there before. His case established the precedent that the prosecution deliberately lying like that to the jury was a denial of due process. Before his case, that legal proposition had not been established. So he literally was able to discover new possibilities in old, dusty legal language. And so that's really what kind of motivated me early on to see that, words, the legal lexicon, and language more generally, that words aren't just entertainment, but like Toni Morrison says, they are acts with consequences.
Interesting. And building off of this idea of the importance of words, obviously your work is centered around one word in particular, and it's and our future with that word and how it should be used. And it's challenging. It's a challenging read. And I'm really curious to know, you've got so much in your work about bias, about criminogenic conditions. Why is it necessary, important, central that this word, the N-word, is your thrust of the argument?
Absolutely, yeah, it is. It's at the very heart of my argument. It's why the book didn't get published for over 5 years, even though it was finished, right? Publishers resisted mightily for a whole raft of fears that were not borne out, but they were strong fears nonetheless, because people have suffered real blows to their career, if not lost their career, by using or misusing this word. Bill Maher likes to swagger around saying he'll say anything anytime, but he misused the N-word one time and went on an apology tour with his tail between his legs. I remember that vividly. So this word, I wanted to deploy it because it is unparaphrasable, it's untranslatable, as well as unsayable. Mm-hmm. And I want to explore the power of both linguistic and non-linguistic forms of symbolic communication to challenge us in that way, to challenge boundaries. What does it mean for non-Blacks to be prohibited from saying the word in public, like Bill Maher tried to say, in the same way that Blacks do, right? What does it mean for words to have those kinds of social boundaries around them? And I don't run away from that question. I'm trying to run to it and grapple with it and say, for example, that when I hear students ask me and others, why do Black people get to monopolize the N-word? Why do only y'all get to deploy that word? And I understand why they're saying that, right? Because many of them recognize, and I hear it all the time, many of them recognize that the N-word is a valuable cultural resource. It's so valuable that, say, somebody like Kanye West knew when he added the N-word to, I ain't saying she's a gold digger, but she ain't messing with no broke. When he added that N-word to the end of that couplet, he knew he was adding hundreds of thousands of sales to his bottom line, right? The same with, anybody from Richard Pryor to Dave Chappelle to Pac, Nas, Cube, Hov, anybody who you can, kind of point to in the so-called gangster rap genre, right? The N-word virtuosos who sling it there and drop multi-platinum albums with the N-word, lacing their lyrics throughout. It's recognized as a valuable cultural property, and a lot of non-Blacks want in on it. Hey, let me in on that, right? Why can't I get a piece of that? Why can't I get a taste, right? And the reason is, besides the straight ahead one, about cultural appropriation, this is a form of cultural appropriation that non-Blacks are not getting away with so easily. Most other forms of cultural appropriation have gone on and without consequence, but this is one that a boundary has been erected by many Blacks with respect to. And number two, if you're not a member of the group, the category that's been historically targeted by the epithet, you simply are not in a position to use that epithet with irony, right? By hypothesis, by definition, right? You aren't in a position to say, I am using this word in a way that is ironically self-referential, right? And I can do that because I'm a member of the group that's been targeted by it historically, right? I cannot use If I'm not a member of the historically targeted group, I simply can't use that way. I don't, there's a great magazine out, feminist magazine, BITCH. I don't use that word. Women, feminists can use it because they're members of the historically targeted group, right? They can use it with irony. They can flip it. They can, use it in a lot of different ways. Queer theory is another one. When queer theory in the early 90s took the word queer, which used to be an epithet for a lot of people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That was a strong epithet, and flipped it, inverted it, transvalued it, and made it a core, word in their theory, queer theory. So that is the way that I'm trying to approach the word, define new possibilities in the language for certain kinds of critiques. And maybe we can get into that in a little more.
Very interesting. Yeah, to add a follow-up to that, throughout your book, you talk about the ability of the N-word to be a unifier. And you say, call me an N-word, to express solidarity with those who are frequently referred to in that way. But you also talk about the ability of the N-word to otherize, both by white people to Black people, and also within the Black community. What do you see as the potential dangers of an increase in use of the N-word in the ways that you espouse? And do you see potential issues with the process of really reclaiming this term? And perhaps additionally, what do you see this looking like in everyday? Do you really want people to call you the N-word? What do you want a day-to-day experience to be with your vision of the N-word?
Good question. Yeah, you get into a lot of the nuances of the book right there. Yeah, I, in one sense, am saying that I recognize that the N-word can be used as a term of endearment as well as an epithet, right? When Tupac Shakur says in his Solidarity dirge, life goes on, and the hook to it, how many brothers fell victim to the street? Rest in peace, young nigga, there's a heaven for a G. Be alive if I told you that I never thought of death. My niggas, we the last ones left. When he's saying my niggas there, that is a strong assertion of solidarity, sympathetic identification with, and love for another Black person who is sharing the same social category as you do. They have the same epithet directed at them that you do. And you're saying, in spite of us belonging to this socially despised category, I have nothing but love for you. And you, for me, there's a special bond between us, as soldiers in the same circumstance, struggling against similar forces. And so there's a kind of bond there that's being expressed through the N-word, through taking that and self-referentially flipping it with irony, right? And he could do that because he's a member of that group. So no, I'm not trying to get it to where white people can feel as comfortable referring to Blacks with the N-word as Tupac feels referring to his Black friends and comrades with the N-word. No, I'm not trying to do that. Not trying to defang the word in that way. I wanted things to be recognized, that it is a word that is used to distinguish and distance and otherize and monsterize and demonize. And I want to attack the moral basis for using the word in that way. And I do when I talk about moral luck and the contingency of self and, the biased moral judgments we make about Blacks and others. So I want to explode the moral foundation for even using the word in its negative sense through those arguments. And then I want to build up an alternative foundation to use the word in a positive sense among Blacks within the community. And then when I say, call me one, I'm using it then as a kind of political slogan. That then it's just serving as a purely kind of battle cry. It's a way of saying, when Chris Rock says, I love Black people, but I hate niggas. But what he means by that is, I want to invite you to otherize those Black people we're going to call niggas and make them the punchline of, of this joke. And his core definition of a so-called nigga is a Black person who does a crime when you listen to his routine. So I want to take that sense of the N-word and expose it as having no moral substance or foundation in it at all, and then flipping it and saying, now, the use it still can have. So I'm sorry, let me finish that thought. So what I'm saying when I say call me a nigga is I'm saying I reject Chris Rock's effort to distinguish between lovable Black people and so-called morally condemnable niggas on the basis of their involvement in criminal wrongdoing. I'm saying, but for the grace of God, I could be a criminal. But for the grace of luck, but for the grace of fortuitous circumstances, I too could be one of those people he's calling a nigga. So you might as well call me a nigga too, because the only thing that morally distinguishes me and the people you are calling so-called niggas, that you feel comfortable applying that epithet to, the only thing that distinguishes me from them is luck, right? And that's not a morally relevant distinction. So if you're going to call them one, call me one too. So that's me, making a moral critique of the dichotomy we draw and recognize and distinguish between the worthy and the wicked, the good and the bad, and all of that.
Very interesting. I like what you just said about luck. For me, I believe it was in chapter 3 when you talk at most length about Black criminals being created and rather than found during the criminal trial. And I thought that was probably the most just absolutely compelling part of the book. And I was really curious for you to just expound on that and tell our listeners a little bit about in-group, out-group bias and just everything that blew my mind. If you could give us a quick summary of that before we get into some questions on that front, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure, and there are two parts to it, and so you can refine my response. One part has to do with the moral luck phenomenon generally, and the other part has to do with the social construction of Black criminals. And so I'll start with the second part first. Mm-hmm. They're related, but they're a little different. And when I talk about the social construction of Black criminals, to some people that can sound just fanciful. It can sound like, what do you mean you socially construct Black criminals or any criminals? Criminals are discoverable facts of nature, they will say. Whether, for example, person A killed person B is a question of fact. You can say, here's A standing over B with a smoking gun. Here's a video of A shooting B with that gun. Mm-hmm. Here's a slow motion picture of the bullet coming out of the gun and entering the victim. So there's no question factually about whether A killed B. So how can you say that we socially construct murders, right? That's not something you socially construct. You just look out there in the world and you see A killed B, he's a murderer, mm-hmm. right? And my point in the book is, no, that couldn't be more wrong. That in reality, when you see a person standing over another person with a smoking gun and they've just killed the victim, the person who's standing over them can be guilty of first-degree murder. They could be guilty of second-degree murder. They could be guilty of manslaughter. They could be guilty of criminal negligence, or they could be guilty of nothing at all. Mm-hmm. All 4 or 5 options they could be guilty of on the exact same facts of standing over somebody with a smoking gun that they just intentionally killed. For example, they could have intentionally killed the person in an act of self-defense. Mm-hmm. Then there's no liability, so they're not a murderer. Or they could have killed the person in an act of rage when they walked in on the person molesting their 6-month-old child in daycare, right? In that case, they would claim provocation, and they would be treated not as guilty of murder, but of manslaughter if the jury accepted their provocation claim and said, yes, a reasonable person's sense of self-control, powers of self-control rather, could be sorely tested by that provocation, right? So they would only be guilty of manslaughter there. If they walked into a room, on the other hand, and saw somebody with a, Dodger hat on, and they hate the Dodgers and shoot them for that reason, then they would be guilty of murder, right? They'd be intentional and unprovoked killing. Then they'd be a murderer. And then also, if they thought about the person, 2 days ahead of time and then went in and shot them, they could be guilty of first-degree murder. So you have the same act, shooting a person, killing another person, but it can be characterized as everything from murder to no crime at all, depending on the moral judgment that the jury makes of the wrongdoer. That's what makes the difference between murderers and non-murderers. Not what the person does, but what moral judgments the jury makes of what the person does. And those moral judgments of jurors are subjective processes, subjective mental processes that go on in jurors' minds. They're shared by many of us. We share moral frameworks, to be sure, right? But the jurors are making moral judgments and determining whether or not someone is a criminal and what kind of criminal that person is on the basis of their moral judgments of that person. And those moral judgments can vary. Sometimes they'll make harsher moral judgments of a Black person than a similarly situated white person. So that means that a Black person who kills somebody and claims provocation, they may reject his provocation claim and convict him of intentional killing murder, whereas they may accept the white person's provocation claim and convict them of only manslaughter for the same murder, just because they find the Black person, the Black person to be less sympathetic to them than the white person, right? And in that way, they socially construct criminals. They don't just find them.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And that leads me to a question that I had while I was reading. So let's take this example of the similarly situated Black and white assailants who both commit the same type of murder, and we're sentencing that. And throughout the book, you talk about solidarity with these guilty, culpable assailants. But then particularly in this chapter, I felt like the argument is that they're really not morally culpable, and that this creation of Black criminals, it's about this subjective lens through which jurors, perhaps predominantly white jurors, view Black guilt. So are you making the point overall that we should express solidarity with these culpable wrongdoers, or instead that they're not really culpable and that's why we should express solidarity with them?
Great question. I'm saying, number one, because of the phenomenon of moral luck, we cannot distinguish between the wicked and the worthy. We cannot trust our moral judgments. We can't trust our judgments of blame or praise. We can't trust our evaluations because of the phenomenon of moral luck. So all of our moral evaluations are irrational and illegitimate, because if you flip a coin and say, heads, you're wicked, tails, you're worthy, that's an irrational basis to make a moral judgment of somebody on. Yet that's the basis we make moral judgments of people on all the time, every day, all day, every day. So in that way, I'm saying that all moral judgments are suspect. All are illegitimate and irrational on a deep philosophical level, right? That should give us pause epistemically when it comes to righteously condemning others. Then I go on to say, but if you find that to be a bridge too far, if for whatever reason you just, because it is a counterintuitive proposition, you have to really think about it. And, you're compelled to reach that conclusion, I think, from, looking at it with certain kinds of examples and interrogating the logic of morality and luck and all that. But it's counterintuitive. It's hard to get your mind around that. I can flip a coin, and heads, I'll praise you, tails, I'll blame you, right? That moral judgments can turn on something that irrational, that can on that kind of a basis, right? So, but if you resist that conclusion, even though I think it's true, and say that there is some validity to moral judgments, I say, even if you accept that proposition for the sake of conversation, and that's when I get to the next chapter, the third chapter, I say, the moral judgments that we actually make are biased. So it's not that they're irrational and illegitimate in a philosophical sense, but it's that they are biased, and we can't rely on the moral judgments we make because of our unconscious biases and our limited mental capacities, right? That we really can't avoid, even if there is a difference between good and bad, let's say. So I'm not denying that there's no difference between good and bad, or the wicked and the worthy, as the moral luck, proponent would. But I'm saying when it comes to judging good and bad, we're biased in that we judge Black folks as more bad than similarly situated white folks, assuming that there is a distinction between good and bad. So I point to somebody like Jennifer Eberhardt, for example, who showed us that in making determinations of whether a wrongdoer was death worthy, is deserving of getting the death penalty. Not only did subjects think that Black wrongdoers were more death worthy than white wrongdoers, similarly situated for doing the same kinds of crimes with the same histories, but the darker you were, the more death worthy they thought you were, right? So that's saying, even if you say there is a difference between good and bad, good and evil, we still tend to judge Black hearts as more wicked than similarly situated white hearts. And so we can't trust even our moral judgments, even if the phenomenon of moral luck does not render all our moral judgments irrational and illegitimate.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the death penalty. So that was more the focus in chapter 8, where you're talking about praxis, and one of the new words I learned while reading your work. And I thought that was really interesting, because that was your clear call to action, that we need to abolish the death penalty in all of its forms for the reasons that you just outlined. But in instances where we're not applying the death penalty, but we're looking, I know that you more generally want us to see leniency in all instances, but what are some concrete changes that you want to see in the way that particularly Black violent criminals are judged?
Yeah, we're going to have to change how we think, not only how we think about violent Black criminals, but how we think about all violent criminals, and recognize that, I'm focusing in on violent Black criminals now because they are often viewed as the worst of the worst for the reasons we just talked about. They have the most depraved hearts in the judgments of a lot of ordinary fact finders and that sort of thing. But what I'm saying is that the price of the kind of revolution in consciousness that I'm advocating, the price of that revolution is consistency. That is, being consistent in your application of it, even when it comes to people you don't like, even when it comes to perpetrators, victimizers who are from the socially dominant group, and victims who are from a socially marginalized group. Even then, and it's hard for a lot of people on the left to remain consistent in their anti-carceral positions when a victim is a Black person, a woman, an LGBTQ member, and the victimizer is a white male, say cis straight from dominant groups in other ways, right? When you see that combination, you have a lot of people on the left who otherwise are saying decarceration, 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 all of a sudden saying punish, punish, punish.
Yeah.
That's what you see over and over, right? And what I'm saying is, and I want to bring it all the way home, Olivia, okay? And this is going to be controversial.
Okay.
I'm saying you have to apply that same framework even when it comes to a case like Derek Chauvin.
Wow. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
All right. Yes. Right now, here and now, when it comes to a case like Derek Chauvin, when Amber Geiger was charged with the shooting death of Botham John in Dallas, he was sitting on his couch, 26-year-old Black male, eating ice cream. She kicked in his apartment door, shot him once, killed him to the chest, right? A lot of people in my timeline were saying she deserved murder conviction, murder, because that's the only way that you can show sufficient care and concern for the life of a Black man who was killed by her, to show that that Black lives really matter, is if you punish her as harshly as the law will allow, and convict her of murder, nothing less than murder. And I lost some followers and friends really about when I said no. What she did was a negligent mistake. She got off on the wrong floor. She thought it was her apartment. It wasn't. So she missed some cues that she should have picked up on. She made a stupid, negligent mistake. I'm not going to deny that, right? Stupid, negligent mistakes in our system usually mean criminal negligence or manslaughter. That's what it means, right? It doesn't mean murder. A lot of homicides are caused out here all the time, tragically, but, not with any malice, and they are manslaughter. So if we're going to say, no, we want her to be guilty of murder here, then, when it comes to other violent offenders, we're not going to be able to resist the same kind of appeal to retribution, retaliation, revenge. We got to punish them, to the maximum amount to show that we really have care and concern for their victims. And it's down that road that destruction lies for criminal justice reform. That's what got us here. That logic over the last 30, 40 years is what got us here, right? So we cannot decarcerate, we cannot make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration on the cheap. We have to overhaul our moral framework, move away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge toward restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption, and apply that alternative moral framework, that new moral compass, to even people we despise and dislike.
Yeah, well, and I think that was an argument that you made really cogently in the book, that it's not about this revenge after the fact, but in the last chapter when you were talking about R. Kelly and Weinstein, and that the purpose of imprisonment, of sentencing, should be to protect potential future victims, to aid in that own person's rehabilitation, and that we need to really check ourselves and our own desire for revenge. And so I found that to be, again, controversial and difficult, but really compelling. And it made me reflect a little bit back on the book. And as you were mentioning earlier, that for women, for members of the LGBT community, that this is a tough pill to swallow. Reading your book, it was hard to think about espousing leniency for people who have committed rapes, for murderers, because I see myself as part of the group that is disproportionately the victims of those crimes. And I know what it's like to walk really fast home, and to know from, as soon as you can talk and understand, that you're never supposed to not be in groups. And so how do we balance leniency, acknowledging criminogenic conditions that lead to these violent crimes, with making sure that victims are kept safe, and that they themselves and others who would end up like them, were their assailants not put away, that we see that balance out?
Absolutely, you're right. We have to make sure that in any of these discussions, we take the interest of victims seriously. Victims must have their interests vindicated. And you even see that in this Derek Chauvin case, right? I'm going to keep bringing it back here because it is right now what has gripped the nation and the world for a long time. We've just had a verdict. And with respect to Derek Chauvin, it could be a victim's right kind of poster case, right? George Floyd was a victim of police brutality. This is a case about victims' rights, right? Mm-hmm. And y'all oftentimes you don't think about a case like this being about victims' rights, right? But it is. We too often think about victims' rights cases having Blacks as the defendants and the victims as, non-Blacks or sometimes Blacks too, Black on Black violence. But The idea that blacks are the victims and whites are the victimizers is something that, we have, especially white police officers are victimizers, is a pattern we're not accustomed to seeing as much. And so we might especially be inclined to think that victims' rights movements are the way to go. We need more victims' rights movement. We need to prosecute more, Derek Chauvins. That's what'll get our justice. That's what'll set us free. That's what'll get us free. Prosecuting more Derek Chauvins and punishing them maximally. Will that make us safer or get us free? Let's first talk about your safety point, because it's an important one. A lot of the activists have said we need to rethink, reimagine safety. Is it making us safer to lock people up for long periods of time? Our police, is there empirical evidence for that? Or is the empirical evidence that, what really deters people is capturing criminals, getting them off the street, incapacitating them, but not necessarily for long, exorbitant lengths of time, right? In fact, you can start losing benefits, and it can go the other way if the length of time runs too long. We're finding also that police who arrest people for minor things, misdemeanors, that those people who are arrested for those misdemeanors pose a greater risk of greater crimes later down the road than those who aren't arrested but are diverted. So it may make us safer not to be as punitive as we are in the long run for people who are concerned about their safety, which we all are. Right? Number one. And then number two, so there's a lot of empirical questions around, what really can make us safe and whether, locking people up for long periods of time actually achieves that end. That's an important empirical question that there's a lot of dispute about right now. And there's a good amount of evidence that our old platitudes and assumptions aren't as accurate as we thought they were. Beyond that, Derek Chauvin, let's stay with him for another moment. What should be his just desert? What should be his punishment for someone who is kind of an abolitionist? I'm not a full-on abolitionist in the sense that I want, and I don't know anybody who really is. This may be a caricature of a position, but I'm not saying I'm going to snap my fingers and all jails and prisons are disappear tomorrow and all police disappear tomorrow, right? Sadly, because of criminogenic conditions, it's foreseeable that people stuck in those criminogenic conditions will turn to crime. And so, we do need to address that problem in some real way. So I'm not an abolitionist in that particular sense, although I certainly do believe that we need to cut back on the police presence in our communities and cut back on the carceral state, big time, make deep cuts in both of them. May not make me a complete abolitionist, but I'm talking about deep cuts, not just reform cuts, but transformational kinds of cuts when we're talking about making these cuts. But take Derek Chauvin. We can focus our attention on him and trying to achieve individualized justice in his case and say, oh, we can do that by convicting him of murder rather than manslaughter, for example. And that is a way that's going to achieve the ends that we want to achieve, which are what? What are those ends we want to achieve? Well, I heard a lot of people in the streets over the summer talking about systemic racism. Will Derek Chauvin's conviction address systemic racism? I'm not so sure. In fact, my concern is that when we convict somebody like Derek Chauvin, it actually gives the impression of accountability. It makes it look like the system can police itself. It makes it look like the system corrects itself, right? Which it can't. And but it makes that look more credible. Conviction reinforces the idea that he's just an outlier, right? He's just a uniquely bad guy. It kind of reinforces this individualist, non-systemic narrative, that says the real problem is just to root out some bad apples. That's all we got to do. Get out these bad apples. And the problem with all that whole approach is that's what we learned in the streets over the summer. Personal accountability will not solve structural problems, right? Personal accountability is all you can get, the most you can get from an individual trial, right? But personal accountability isn't going to address structural problems like traffic stops. Why did Dante Wright, 10 miles away from where the trial was happening, while the trial was still going on, wind up another unarmed dead Black man at age 20? Why? Because he had an air freshener hanging on his rear view mirror and some expired tags, right? That's a structural systemic problem, right? Broken windows policing is a structural systemic problem. The criminalization of poverty through how we crack down on houseless people, that's a structural systemic problem. You're not going to solve that with individual accountability trials, right? And that's my concern, that a lot of people are going to take away from the conviction of Derek Chauvin. They're going to say, oh, well, we are somehow really solving the problem of systemic racism when this doesn't even address or look in the direction of systemic racism.
And what does?
What does is unbundling the police, for example, recognizing that implicit bias is intractable, that we cannot root it out. So you cannot train police out of it. You can't give them implicit bias training and suddenly they're going to turn around and self-regulate their unconscious mental reflexes.
Yep,
it doesn't work that way.
Doesn't sound like it would. When you
it
say
doesn't
like
work that way. I used to think it did, and I used to go around talking about, oh, the hope of the future. But I saw the studies come in, and they were bitter pills to swallow. There's very little. What they showed is, yes, we do have these unconscious biases, but there's very little we can do to regulate them, self-regulate them. So what that means is, since you cannot really meaningfully reduce, let alone eliminate, the biases that law enforcement has against members of socially marginalized groups like Black folk, right? Since you can't eradicate or reduce those biases, the only way to limit the harm that come from those unconscious biases toward those stereotyped communities is to minimize the contacts between those people who have those unconscious biases and the members of that community. In other words, those people that I'm talking about are the police. The police are violence workers. They're officially violence workers. We give them a Glock with loaded ammunition, a stun gun, mace, a billy club, handcuffs. They are violence workers, right? When we have violence workers coming into contact with members of marginalized groups, stereotyped groups, their unconscious biases will drive them to unavoidably harm members of that group because of their unconscious bias, right? Because of the stereotypes that they cannot control. So the only way to limit the harm of those stereotypes, those unconscious biases, is to limit the contact. Take police out of traffic stops. Take police out of mental health care. Take police out of drug interdiction for overdoses and the like. Take police out of a whole range of activities, out of broken windows policing that we've had them doing. We shouldn't be criminalizing a lot of things that we're criminalizing in the first place. And police should be focusing on one thing and one thing only. And that is solving violent crimes, solving murders and rapes. Right now, the rape clearance rate in many states and cities is only around 20% or less for rape. For homicides, it's some places 30% or less. That's because police, instead of focusing their resources on solving homicides and rapes, which are resource intensive, right? They're chasing turnstile jumpers. They're going after broken windows policing. They're going after air fresheners hanging from rear view mirrors, right? So that's what the folks in the streets were saying over the summer. And that's what I've also tried to convey in this book, that we need to reimagine, rethink how we approach crime and punishment, try to approach wrongdoers as human beings, fallible human beings, try to have social intervention programs that support them as fallible human beings, and don't try to punish our way and jail our way out of our social problems.
Wow. Absolutely. And I think my word takeaway from the book, as I mentioned, is criminogenic. Hadn't heard it before, and now I'm seeing it everywhere. And I think particularly what you just mentioned regarding broken windows policing and the way that that influences criminogenic conditions is a really interesting intersection. So near the end of your book, you start talking about Tommy Shelby and his work, Dark Ghettos, and how when individuals of a society have been treated in a manifestly unjust way, that they stop owing the same debts to society that those of us who benefit from the system and institutions do. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that you highlighted was this difference between punishing and condemning, and that an institution may still have the right to punish these individuals who particularly commit violent crimes, even if they can't condemn them. So more within the framework of your perspective and your views, rather than Shelby's argument, how does that come into play for you?
Yeah, punishing, even without being able to condemn, gives us a chance to think about what we mean by justice. Mm-hmm. Your question about the connection between Thomas Shelby and his work and my work is this. You know, a lot of times people think about justice in the way that we saw it on display in the Derek Chauvin trial. We think about justice on a retail level, on an individualized level. We think of individualized justice, if you will, right? Blaming and punishing a particular individual or praising them. Whereas John Rawls' analysis, along with Tommy Shelby's, invites us to think about justice not as something that we achieve with respect to just an individual like Derek Chauvin, but as a virtue of institutions, right? We look at the basic social structure and we ask about its justice. You know, is it just? Mm-hmm. And if justice can't be, if this basic social structure cannot be characterized as just, if in fact it is intolerably unjust, then, you know, what does it mean to really say that we achieve justice in the Derek Chauvin case with a verdict of guilty, right? That is justice, perhaps, on some kind of individual level. You might call that individual accountability. That's what I hear some of the activists, the kind of language I hear them using today. They talk about the difference between accountability and justice. And they say George Floyd did not get justice, but there was only accountability for Derek Chauvin. And I'm gathering from their usage that what they mean by that is, you know, there's a very limited sense of justice in which Derek Chauvin has been brought to justice, mm-hmm. right? But there's a broader sense of justice, you know, that has to do with systemic injustice and systemic racism and the kinds of things that Rawls was talking about when it comes to the basic structure of a society being just or unjust. Mm-hmm. And at that level, this Derek Chauvin verdict doesn't mean anything from the standpoint of systemic justice or injustice.
Well, that, of course, brings us back to what you said earlier, that personal accountability won't address structural problems.
There it is. Bingo.
Wow. Well, I know that we are coming close on time, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. This is such an incredible work. And to all of our listeners, if you haven't already read it, I encourage you to stop what you're doing, which is listening to this, and start reading right now. But before we wrap up, Jody, is there anything else that you wanted to share with our listeners?
Yeah, Olivia, I've this has been just such a good conversation. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it. And yeah, I hope that the moment we're in right now, this post-verdict in the Derek Chauvin case, gives us all an opportunity to engage in real critical self-reflection and perhaps self-revision in matters of criminal justice. I'm hoping that's the case.
I'm hopeful as well. And I want to thank you again for joining us this afternoon. It was such an honor to get to talk to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to The Bigger Picture. For links to some of the things we talked about today, visit our show page, bedrosian.usc.edu/bigpicture. If you have more questions for our speakers or topics you'd like to cover, let us know. Check out our website, social media, or even email us. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review so other people can find us. Until we catch up again, we hope that you will take care of yourself and your neighbors from all of us at the USC Bedrosian Center. Thank you.